Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another session of FCW Bookshelf Live. I'm Troy Schneider, I'm the editor of FCW, and I'm really pleased to have with me today author Pagan Kennedy. Pagan is a science journalist, author of multiple books, and for a long time wrote one of my favorite features, which was the Who Made That column for the New York Times. And she's here to talk about Inventology, how we dream up things that change the world. It's a great book about the creative process and what can be done on that. I have all my visual aids here. We talk about a little bit in the most recent issue of FCW, which you can find around on the show floor. But obviously you're going to hear in much more detail today, and everyone gets a book, and if you're interested to have Pagan sign it, she'll be happy to do that after the session here today. So with that, let's dive right in.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, what this book is really about and what prompted you to write it?
Yeah, sure. So I was, as Troy mentioned, I was writing the column in the New York Times Magazine. I don't know if you guys saw it, but there was a full-page column, and it had a big picture of an object. And then my job was to find out who had made that object, who was the first person to conceive of this object. And sometimes I got to pick it, but often the editors picked it because it would look good on the page or whatever. So I would be handed objects like the smoke detector, the super soaker. Actually, one of my objects that I wanted to do was the home pregnancy test, all kinds of objects like that that are really famous, but we don't know who made them. And so I did this week after week for almost 2 years and had a chance to talk to an enormous amount of inventors, or if they were dead, their colleagues and children and so on, and get this insight into their creative process. And particularly that moment when a new thing is born, when somebody comes up with an idea for something that actually may even seem to be impossible to build at that moment, or crazy or useless. And as I did this week after week, I began noticing patterns. I talked to the cell phone inventor, and then the next week I was talking to the daughter of the guy who invented the trampoline, and I was thinking, wow, there's a lot of really similar patterns here. I began noticing these patterns, and then I thought, it would be great to crack this code because, I personally would like to know, what they're doing to come up with these new ideas and these new possibilities. So that it kind of seamlessly turned into a book where I wanted to be able to take those insights and really dig deep and talk not just to the inventors, but also to psychologists, economists, ethnographers, all the people who were coming at this question from multiple angles.
And you distinguish invention from another word that gets tossed around in government a lot these days, of innovation. This is really not about innovation. Could you, just so we're all on the same page, talk about how you define those two terms and sort of where you're making the break?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually kind of had to come up with a definition because it is very fuzzy. And it seemed to me that most people who were using the words used invention to talk about the very beginning of the process, when something, like the cell phone, the handheld cell phone, might seem completely impossible, not buildable, and the person or the people who kind of bring that thing from the realm of non-existence into the first glimmer of existence. And then innovation is commonly used as after there's a prototype, after you've proved it's possible, then there's, of course, the whole next step, which is to make the thing affordable, scale it up, actually get it out there into the hands of lots and lots of people. So I really wanted to drill down. I think there's been so much written about innovation, about how once the idea exists, to get it out there, make money off of it. But I was interested in the really early part, which is really the most mysterious part of the process, where something is just floating around in one person's head or maybe a couple people's heads, and they have to figure out a path to possibility. Yeah.
And there are several different paths or processes that you talk about in the book, but we've only got about 40 minutes. We're not going to cover them all. Let's talk about serendipity, which is the one that seems to have sort of the most fertile ground, a lot of more interesting material, and it's also one that's a little bit misunderstood because people tend to think of serendipity as this dumb luck, or I'm Isaac Newton sitting under the tree and I get hit on the head with an apple and suddenly I've got it. And you make a pretty compelling case that it's not quite that simple. So when we talk about serendipity and how that helps with invention, what do we mean?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. Just to back up for a moment, one of the first patterns I noticed was that there were a whole group of inventors who found a problem that didn't exist anymore. That nobody else had noticed existed. They often were at the forefront of the problem and they saw it and they realized that they could come up with a solution. But what I hadn't, we have that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention, and we kind of know that that's part of the way we come up with new ideas. What I hadn't expected was to run into so many people who came up with a solution before they knew what the problem was. In this process, we often call accidental discovery or accidental invention. And these were people, and we can talk about some of these cases, these were people who just came up with something cool and thought, this has got to be useful for something. And often it could take them a while to find out what the problem was that fit this new kind of new exciting possibility they had found. An example would be, say, the smoke detector. There was a guy trying to make a kind of very niche machine that would help with static electricity in factories. So he was trying to make something that would measure static electricity, and then he noticed that this was the 60s, so like people were smoking at work as very Mad Men style. And so somebody was smoking and the meter on this static machine went wild, and he said, wow, well, I've just made a cigarette detector. That's really cool. And then he was talking to his friend who worked at Honeywell about, just this cool thing. He didn't know what it was good for. And the guy at Honeywell was like, this is a problem we've been trying to crack for a long time. You may have just created a home smoke detector that could be battery powered. And in fact, he had. And so that was something where there were actually all these people out there trying to solve this problem. Most of them were focused not on detecting smoke, but they were trying to figure out how to detect heat. That was kind of the early idea in smoke detectors. So by just finding this kind of pre-existing solution, he opened up a new way that really a lot of people just hadn't seen before.
And he needed someone else to figure out this is the application of the technology.
Yeah, exactly.
And then other people come and they figure something out, and then they just keep working to try and find a use for it. And one of my favorite stories is the NASA engineer who came up with the super soaker, which is almost as cool as the things that you build at NASA. And can you talk a little bit about sort of how that came about?
Sure. This was Lonnie Johnson, and actually, I found him really helpful when I interviewed him, because I wasn't really aware of how important accidental invention and serendipity was in the creative process back then. It was sort of at the beginning when I was doing this column. And he told me this story about how he had been a NASA engineer, and he was working on this heat pump. And he had engineered his own little nozzle at home that he wanted it to be very powerful. So he'd made this design of this very powerful nozzle. He was testing it in his bathroom. He hooks it up, and the water goes just shooting across the room. And he got so excited about this. And then he saw in that, he was so excited just about the way the water moved, he knew it had to be a toy somehow. And he would dedicate, this is another part of the book, I talk a lot about how much easier it is to be an inventor now than it was, say, in the 1980s when Dr. Johnson was working, because it was really horrible to try and go out with a toy product. Then there was no Kickstarter, there was no, there was no way to just 3D print something. There were all kinds of things that made it much harder for him. So he would have to spend the next 10 years trying to convince everybody else that he'd made this nozzle that was going to transform the toy industry. He built the whole super soaker around it. But, when I got very interested in that moment he talked about where he saw the way the water moved, and he saw something in it, and I was so curious about what had made him get so excited about that. So we talked a lot. He was just like, it was something in the movement of the water. And that really keyed me in to the fact that there's creativity is not just something that happens in our heads. It's a kind of ability to observe things in your environment and get very excited about them.
And I think the idea, I was struck that he had this idea of a nozzle, but then it took years to figure out how to refine this. And so there is that inspiration, and it's the Thomas Edison thing of 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration, of, a key part of inventing is to figure out how to turn it into something and drive it forward. And sometimes someone offers that to you as a solution, like the smoke detector, or with Johnson, he just kept slogging away. And that gets to, at some point, it goes from invention to innovation there. But, that actual moment of inspiration is still the kind of magical mystery in this. And some people see something and get it, and 100 others will walk by and never notice it. Did you find that there are certain ways of approaching things, or certain types of people who are just, better tuned? And what makes for an inventor?
That's a great question. Well, actually, just to give you a sense of how huge this kind of creative observation or accidental invention is, the term accidental invention makes it sound like it almost never happens. But when I dug into research in the surveys of inventors, there was one survey of thousands of inventors that asked them where their initial idea had come from. 50% of people said their idea had come from a mistake, an accident, a project, some kind of project where they were trying to do something else, and they noticed something weird, and they got excited about that weird thing. So if 50% of the big ideas come from what we're not trying to do, I think that maybe tells us something about the invention and innovation stream. But in terms of what we can do personally, I found a lot of inspiration from an information scientist named Sanda Erdelitz, who did a study where she asked people to describe, this was more of a library research information seeking study, and she asked people where they got their ideas when they were, say, researching in the library. And she noticed there were three types of people. There were what she called the non-encounterers. Now, none of them is better or worse. I'm just going to say that. It's just three different styles. The non-encounterers were people who would say, okay, this is what I need to do. They'd go out and research it. They'd get what they needed. They did not have ADD at all. They just, figured out what they were going to do. They got the information. They did it. The occasional encounterers were pretty much like that, although sometimes they'd find some really delicious nugget or have a weird kind of chance encounter that would change the way they thought about something, and then they would change course. And then there were the super encounterers, and these are the people who go into the project thinking, all right, I'm just going to use my antenna. I have no plan. I'm going to kind of go in and soak in the information and see what speaks to me and and there's a kind of trusting in the universe quality of it, of figuring out that whatever you need is probably just going to kind of come to you. And so those super encounters are very interesting, because part of being a super encounter is sort of just deciding that you are one, and that you will just find this information will just come to you.
Sort of that pattern recognition. I mean, some of it seems to be an aptitude for it, and some of it is that conscious decision. Now, did you find in your research that, I'm sort of pivoting from individuals to institutions here, that there were ways to kind of make that type of process more productive? I mean, you go back to the smoke detector example, and the inventor talked to someone who was in another field who said, I get that, I never would have built it, but I see the use. Whether it's putting people in proximity to one another or giving people that think space. I think of the Google 20% time, or the way that Edison did the first labs to get people working near one another. Are there ways to increase the hit rate on this?
Right, yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the most interesting ways is, and we were talking about this at lunch, are these online problem-solving contests. And I know that government agencies are running these a lot, where government agency or a company or a nonprofit might have a problem they can't solve, and then they put up a contest. Like NASA will do this quite often, and then whoever comes forward, anybody can come forward with a white paper and propose a solution. And what's cool about these is they're usually judged by people who don't know the name, are not allowed to see the names and the resumes of the contestants. And so what's really interesting about this is we can now look at these problem-solving contests to see who wins them. And there's been some amazing research by a guy named Kareem Lakhani at Harvard Business School, where he got all the data from this online problem-solving site called Inventive. Have you guys anybody know Inventive? It's you should definitely check out this website. It's so fascinating. They ask you, how to make a better vacuum cleaner filter, or how to get fish over past a bridge or something. There's all these crazy questions in there and people competing to answer them. So Kareem looked at who had actually won these contests, and he found that people who are outsiders, who are not experts in a given field, are actually more likely to solve the problems inside the field. So I was able to research to interview one of those people. This guy named Adam Rivers, he had solved a problem. There was a food company that had a milkshake, a health shake they were trying to make, and it would turn this disgusting shade of purple. And it was too hard for them to figure out why this was happening. Now, Adam was a grad student in oceanography, and he knew that there's all kinds of reactions in the ocean involving iron and coming together with vegetable matter that can turn water really horrifying shades of purple and stuff. So he figured that was it, and in a weekend, he solved that problem. He not only figured out what was happening, but how to undo it, just in a weekend with stuff he bought at Walmart. And he won $25,000 for that weekend of work. So I think that shows how, that incredible problem we have is that the people with the problem are often isolated from the people who have that weird solution, and they may not even be speaking the same language. So we definitely need to bring those outsiders in, and there's all kinds of creative ways that we're doing that now.
And on the individual level, you talked about these super encounterers. They sort of decide to be that way, and I think maybe not everyone, but most people, probably most people who are here in the audience, you know, I'm a pretty creative person. I'd like to do more of this and create the time to, you know, to try and observe and figure out what's going on. But there was one part of your book that I thought sort of, you know, got to this. And, you know, one of the inventors you talked to said, you know, despite his serendipitization, Makri, M-A-K-R-I?
Makri, yeah.
Acknowledge that there are downsides to all this whimsy. You could spend years exploring the unknown and have nothing to show for it. More to the point, it's very hard to convince someone to hire you to chat with strangers, gaze at the clouds, and wander on unknown streets. And that's sort of my question, particularly if you get into government contracting space where it's taxpayer dollars. How do you create the space to be an inventor or to be open to invention without getting yourself fired?
Yeah, I mean, when I was doing the New York Times column and talking to a lot of inventors, I talked to so many people who faced exactly that problem, and often they'd come across a really exciting idea in the course of their research on something else, but it just wasn't accepted. Or, you know, a big problem too is that you may have a discovery and be in the entirely wrong field for it. So, you know, if you're working in drug research and you find a cure for baldness, it has no value there, you know. So what is your option? You know, maybe nowadays with the internet we have more ways to connect with people in other industries, but it can be really tough. So that was, you know, so many inventors I know struggled with that question of how to take, you know, it's extremely risky, and often when they come up with the idea, it sounds completely crazy. One person like that was Chuck Hull, who was the inventor of the first 3D printer. And when he came up with this idea in the 1980s, he was actually working at a plant where they made these UV lights. It's super complicated, but something about that technology gave him the idea for this first 3D printer. He went to his boss and said, wow, I have this idea for making this thing that could replicate any object. And the boss is like, we're making UV lights here, you know? So he had to figure out that people in the car industry really, really wanted this and had to. So a lot of people, you know, I call them the cross-pollinators. They're the people who have to make that leap to find the world in which they'll be appreciated or understood, or the world where people need them, or their problem is a big problem. And for Chuck Hull, you know, at the time, it really seemed like nobody would want a 3D printer. This was just some nutso, you know, Star Trek idea that seemed to be totally useless. So it was partly that faith he had, and then having the kind of social skills to reach across and to the auto engineers, who, of course, were like super psyched to get this thing where they could make a handle, you know, in a day or two. Mm-hmm. So, and yeah, I thought that was really interesting in the book. You know, you talk about the ideas coming from outsiders, but rarely are they people who just are total laymen. They're experts in something, and it's that transposing it into a new space. But you raise that obvious challenge that, okay, what I know best is my field. I may be least well positioned to innovate in that field because of my preconceived notions, but how do I even know what the problem is elsewhere? How do I connect? Is that something where it happens successfully and repeatedly? Is that something that's happening because of the force of will of the inventor? Are there organizations that are figuring out how to sort of broker that cross-pollination? Or are there just, you know, are there people who that's their job? They go into the organization and just play matchmaker? Or is it all of the above? Well, I think, you know, we're living in a golden age for inventors, and all of you are inventors, potentially. I mean, I really think this is something that's accessible to everybody, because it's not just knowing about a certain, you know, chemistry or a certain kind of technology. If you really know a problem well, you know, I found a lot of inventors who didn't have a huge amount of technical skill, but they knew a problem cold. And now there's these tools that the Bell Labs engineers of the 1960s, we all have, that these tools that those people could have only dreamed about. You know, there are new ways of getting funded. There are new ways of getting feedback. As an individual, you can work with a factory, you know, just from your phone, which was not possible even 10 years ago. So there's a democratization happening now that's unbelievable. And I mean, even if you review a product on Amazon, you maybe have been part of somebody's invention process, because I've talked to inventors who look at those reviews and say, oh, that's a great idea. You know, I should redo my product this way. But I think there's an accessibility there for all of us that's very, very exciting. You know, one real realm where this is happening is in the field of prosthetics, of people who have, say, upper body disabilities, and they're building their own bodies. I met a woman named Debbie Latour who was born with her one arm ending at the elbow, and she had to wear this very painful brace her entire life, to the point where her body was breaking down because the brace was very painful, and the movement she had to do to open and close her hand, mechanical hand, was extremely, was just ruining her body. She had this moment where she thought, you know what, nobody's going to solve this problem but me. There's no money in prosthetics. There's nobody who cares about this like I do. And she came up with this little gizmo that sits on her back. It's got a little push button. She can push it just by doing this movement with her back, a very subtle movement. She has no harness now. And it's this tiny little push button thing, and she operates her hands. She's unbelievable with it. You can't even see that she's wearing anything. She invented that herself. She shared the patent. It's with the hospital where she works. She made no money off of it, but she's sharing it with other people who might need it. And, you know, she solved this problem that nobody else is going to solve for her. And that was something I found very exciting, that I think that each of us has insight into a problem that nobody else knows about. I mean, everybody is the expert in their own pain. And sees something really unique about it. And, you know, even if it's just, you know, we all at home like have our things we make out of wire and duct tape, you know, but sometimes those things turn out to be really important for other people too.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned the sharing of the designs for the prosthetics, and I think it's also in your book, talk about how you know, just the tools for getting that feedback are so much more significant now. It's not just the research that you can do on the internet, or the way that you can take your new toy and try and market it without having to go knock on Hasbro's door. That I was struck by the idea that people who use things like like Kickstarter or Indiegogo, some of the most successful ones are using it less for funding than for the market research and to get the feedback. And you know, if you could talk about a little bit of those examples and just the tools that are available for people who are trying to find ways to get out of their own knowledge silo and connect with others.
Yeah, that's what surprised me when I talked to some of the inventors who are using these online crowdfunding platforms. Often they're people who they're pretty talented, and they have a lot of ideas. They could get money just from, you know, being, you know, getting a day job or getting funding from a venture capital firm or something like that. But they want to use Kickstarter because they get so many ideas from their potential customers. So they will hear from people who say, for instance, there's this guy this little company that's making this really cool thing, which is a sort of smoke detector, but it would also be able to use sensors to read the amount of pollen or pollution in the air and so on and so forth. And they want to make this a gizmo that would be used so that we could all track the pollution. For instance, if you live in China and you want to track plumes of pollution, the citizens would control that information rather than the government. But then, you know, the inventor there told me, well, then we heard from people in the Midwest who told us this should also tell us if there's a tornado coming. And that was something they had never thought about because they all live in New York. And, so hearing from people and having customers, there's an interesting space now where I think the customers and the makers are coming together and kind of figuring things out together, which is really exciting.
Yeah. And I want to come back to maybe some of the the challenges or the downsides of things, but I want to make sure we leave time for audience questions and don't get too far into it. So if any of you have questions for Pagan, let's take those now rather than me take all the time. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Can I restate that just so
yeah,
people can hear?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, using the example of the intermittent wiper and some sort of obstacles to moving out because the inventor wanted to monetize it and was having trouble finding ways to do that. And so the profit motive and the business model and how that plays into this as either a catalyst or an obstacle.
Yeah, and I hope I'm getting, because I haven't written about that story, but I know what you're talking about. So if you guys know the story of the intermittent wiper, and I've forgotten the name of that guy, but he, I think, got the idea kind of stolen out from under him by a big company, one of the car companies, then put it in their car, and he didn't have much recourse. So that is a really tough thing for small inventors to feel like their ideas can be stolen. And my inventor friends, now this gets all into patent law, and I'm like not the person to talk to you about that. But my inventor friends tell me that patent law has changed a lot recently to help inventors stake out ideas like that and have a little more claim to them. But that is a really tough thing. And, we're living in a really interesting period of having these 3D printers pop up where you may have an idea, but if somebody can print it out easily, it can be very hard to protect that idea. So that can be very tough. And, I would say that almost all of the inventors I've talked to really weren't very motivated by money, because if they had been, they would have done something else. It's a very risky proposition to get a big idea out in the world, but most people I talked to they were in love with their idea and so excited about it, and if they wanted any money, they wanted just enough money so they could go back into their workshop and keep playing, and so that, it's very much like being a musician or an artist or anything else. If you love doing it, that's such a big part of it, and I think it can be really tricky. Like anything else that's creative, is translating that into a business is very tough.
When we were talking earlier, you mentioned the issue that so many of these inventors, if they're not the sort of, mythical person out in their workshop just doing this as, as the lone genius, if they're trying to do it within their workplace, more often than not, they're sort of doing it on the side and keeping it hidden away until they have something to show. They're, trying to create space for invention on their own, and, it's sort of a byproduct of their work rather than their core job.
Yeah. I'm just working on a piece now about this woman I discovered after I wrote the book, named Meg Crane, who was the first originator of the idea of the home pregnancy test. And she was supposed to receive $1 from her company as the patenter of that idea. She told me she never actually got the $1. But what she was really passionate about was getting this new possibility out to women who, at the time, in the 60s, there were no workplace protections for women who got pregnant. Women were frequently fired for being pregnant. So this test would have had enormous social impact. And of course now it's just it's like in every rom-com, there's a pregnancy test, right? But she really had this, and she had a fantastic life. She's still alive, so I shouldn't talk like she's dead, but she is an incredible person and had a really fun, amazing, cool life of traveling around and trying all these, she got it out there in Canada first and then the US. And so often people are so excited about creating an entirely new possibility in the world, something that really didn't exist before. And often they won't know your name. Meg Crane, I only found her with enormous digging and sweat. So she's not famous, but to have that lever on the world where something that you imagined actually gets out there and changes people's lives, I think is just seems to be, it's an incredibly rewarding thing.
Well, the money would be nice
and
too.
Money is always nice.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Will you conclude that inventors have a certain amount of intelligence, intellect, or can anybody just come up with an idea?
Yeah.
Well, this is what I think, especially, so there's kind of a bunch of different kinds of invention. And I think what's most exciting, one of the most exciting kinds to me are those inventions where somebody sees the problem that nobody else saw before. So often that means being really caring about the problem more than anybody else. So it's not just being smart, which is obviously important, but it's also actually feeling the pain of that problem. So an example would be my editors gave me around the August when I don't even know, I'm not a tennis person, so there's a lot of tennis stuff happening, right? And they want me to tell the story of the ball hopper, which is that basket that the balls pop up into, and who came up with that. And it took me forever to find the guy. He was in his 80s, still very much alive, and I bet you can guess what he had done for a living. He was a tennis pro who had to pick up a bazillion. He actually worked at camps where kids wouldn't pick up the tennis balls. And so he, again, was ruining. His body was hurting from stooping down so much, and he just had to find a better way. So I think it can also be that our situation can give us insights, that, a situation that's really frustrating and goes on for a long time, and where it sort of cracks open your imagination and makes you able to see something that nobody else can see. So I would guess that all of us maybe have some situation like that might have huge potential in it. So I would say it's as much it can be as much the situation as the person, if that makes sense.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
How important are persistence and timing in inventions? And I'm thinking in particular the electric car and the digital camera.
Right. Persistence and coming at the right time, not being too far ahead of the curve.
You've got a great example there of the electric car, because people have been talking about that for 100 years, and it just hasn't been happening. And one tough thing is there's a really interesting dynamic where invention is really tied up with science fiction in an odd kind of way, because something like the electric car, a lot of people envisioned what it could be before it could even be built, And so I'm sure it was in science fiction movies or something. Or you look at Star Trek, which had so many things in Star Trek have actually became real items after Star Trek, and we all it sort of paved the way for us to want these things. So I think that there's that interesting entanglement of culture and politics and invention where, it seems like you're thinking, that there are times that are not right for an invention. And then there are I got really interested in Marty Cooper, who was the inventor of the first handheld cell phone. And he envisioned that back in the 1960s, when it would have been impossible. At that point, a mobile phone was this big, and it was in a car. So when anybody talked about a cellular phone, what they meant was a thing this big that was in a car or truck. And nobody was thinking about handhelds. But he had this insight partly because he worked at Motorola they made walkie-talkies, and they would test out these walkie-talkies, and he saw that these things, you put a communicator in somebody's hands and nobody can go back again. Once they've experienced that, they started playing with this in hospitals where they would give the surgeons and the nurses these sort of super-powered walkie-talkies that worked almost like cell phones. And then but they were experimental, so when these things broke, the surgeons would have a fit and say, I need my walkie-talkie and stuff. And he realized that people, once they've crossed over into a handheld communicator, they can't cross back again, because now everything else in your life has reorganized around it. You've found new ways of going about your day. And so he was absolutely convinced this would happen, but it was not buildable. And so he really kind of paved this almost science fiction path to the cell phone, where he came up with the prototype and so on and so forth, and lobbied the FCC, and that's a long story. But he was very much almost like a science fiction writer.
He was the sort of the converse of what you were talking about. Most people had this idea and figure out what to do. He sketched a picture and then kept hammering at it and where to go. We are coming right up on time. A couple quick housekeeping items again. Pagan will be happy to sign books here in just a moment. We will be doing another of these FCW Bookshelf Live tomorrow morning, where our next guest will be author John Johnson, talking about every data and the things you think you understand about data but don't. I'd encourage you to join us for that. And I want to go with one last question here. You can take it either way you want. Is there sort of one parting piece of advice you would give to people about how to sort of create space for inventing, or is there just one of your favorite invention stories that we didn't get to?
Well, I would just like to say that my object in writing this book was to empower people to feel that they should and could be involved in the invention stream, and that it's really up to all of us to figure out what kind of technology we want and who we want it to serve. And that I think we all should be much more engaged in figuring out what should exist. So I am hoping you will join me in doing that, because we've got a lot of problems to solve on this planet. Yeah. So I think we need all of us figuring out how to do that. So I'm hoping we will all do that together.
Excellent. Well, Pagan, it's a great book. Thank you for taking the time today. It's been a pleasure. So,
Thanks
thank
a
you,
lot.
Everyone.
Thanks to you guys.